aren't women in a lot of positions of political power, women might expect that if they make a demand, it's not going to be realized. And so why go participate in politics if it's going to be meaningless? So the benefits to political participation might be lower for women. But a question that I'm going to put in front of you for the next hour or so, and I should say, please feel free to interrupt me with questions at any point. I know that's against the norm, but we're going to talk a lot about breaking norms, and so I'm really happy to break this one as well. What if women's political participation isn't purely a function of their own independent and rational agency, but is instead a function of collective processes of bargaining, but also collective coercion or relational coercion? And so what I'm going to argue, and I'll spend a little more time talking it through, I'm going to argue that in fact, what we see emerging is a patriarchal political order, where women's political exclusion persists because it serves the interests of those with political power. And in fact, the reason we see women vote is not because it benefits women to vote, but because it benefits men to vote. And so looking at women's electoral participation and seeing such high rates of voter turnout is not necessarily an indication of their political empowerment. And so what are the building blocks of this? Why do women vote but not participate otherwise? I'm going to argue today that politics in rural India, and arguably other parts of the world, though I'm going to really focus today on rural India, centers around households. And that households, as the fundamental unit of social organization, are also the fundamental unit of political organization. And households cooperate in making political decisions, meaning that households make decisions jointly together to both maximize the benefits that they're going to get and because there are incentives to do so. But also because households are the unit where patriarchy is defined. When we think about the definition of patriarchy, it's really about the male head of household being the presumed head of household. And so there are also incentives for those who have power in the household to enforce and potentially coerce the cooperation of others in their household. And because of a combination of all the things that were on the last slide, patriarchal norms that are biased against women, inequalities in resources, and institutions that haven't elevated or ensured the protection of women, what we see is that men end up as the political agent or the political representative or the political head of the household. And what this means is that we're likely to see no gender gap in voter turnout, not because women are voting on their own volition, but because women are voting in many instances because they've been told to vote so, or because they fear sanctioning if they don't vote so. And this will be seen in the fact that women have a lot of very imperfect autonomy over their vote choice. But in costlier forms of political participation, where women's political participation is not strategically useful for those who have dominance and power in the household, we're going to see a gender gap in that form of political participation. And so this is a little bit of the bleak story. What about the prospects? We're also going to go there and see how this can change, and also see how proving how this changes proves that this is the underlying model of how things are operating. So when then would women participate more actively in politics? I'm going to argue that gaining autonomy from the household enables women new spaces to form political identities, but that alone isn't enough because of all of these systems that are built to benefit those with power. There's going to be substantial backlash to trying to change those institutions and systems. And so women also need not only autonomy from the household, but solidaristic ties with other women so that they can collectively act to demand representation in political institutions. I'm going to test this in a number of ways, and I'll describe this in more detail later, but I'm going to leverage two original surveys conducted in rural India in one state of India. The first was a survey that sampled 15 women and half of their husbands in 375 villages. And the second is a survey that censused all adults in 6 villages. I'm going to pair this with 200 qualitative interviews of women and their husbands to understand the process of political decision making. And these are randomly sampled women from the same communities. And then all of this is going to get combined with 2 natural experiments. One that leverages arbitrary variation in the presence of women's groups, and another that leverages arbitrary variation in where those women's groups received a gender consciousness raising program. And hopefully today, you're not going to get all of the goods. It's unfortunately a little hard to present in 1 hour, but I'm going to show you that households shape women's political behavior, and that men dominate household decision-making, and that this explains the gender gap that we observe, the dual gender gaps that we observe in political participation, but that participation in women's groups can substantially increase women's political participation by fostering collective action. Okay, and challenging resistance. And unfortunately, I'm going to show you there is a lot of resistance. So a little bit of background on the context. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm in the mixed methods class, and we might be helpful for us. Were your interviews before or after your surveys? How are they related or not? We're going to talk about it later.
I have a slide. I don't think I have those answers on the slide, so I'll give you those answers now. But when I get into the methods, please jump in with other questions that have come up that might be relevant for that class. These interviews were done after the first survey, but before the second survey. In part because when the first survey was done, I didn't quite understand the depth of how the process worked. So this was meant to help understand. That revealed a puzzle, and these interviews helped me understand it. Okay. So a little bit of background, and I haven't hinted at this yet, but it's going to be a big and important part of the theory, is the lurking patronage democracy and the prevalence of clientelism in these communities. In fact, I'm going to argue that women's exclusion sustains clientelism in these communities and is built on it. And so as proof that this is a very clientelistic society, I'm going to give you some evidence. But really quickly, what I mean by a patronage democracy is I mean where the state monopolizes access to jobs and services, and those public programs and public services are allocated at the discretion of elected officials. Very simply, it means that you can exchange access to public services for electoral support. So some proof of this. This is actually from a different survey than what I've mentioned. It's a survey for those of you who are staying next week. This is from an ongoing project with Jonathan Phillips, who will be here, where we're trying to more accurately measure clientelistic ties. But what we see in our survey is that about 70% of people in these communities are willing in their survey to say that it is acceptable for an elected official to give a job to a family member or a friend, even when there is a more qualified candidate. Almost 80% are willing to say that it's acceptable for an elected official to ask for a bribe in exchange for a ration card. The BPL card is a below the poverty line card that gets you access to subsidies. About 40% say that they know the name of a political broker, someone who would help you navigate the electoral system in exchange for either money or your vote. The same proportion say that they know, engage with, and talk to these brokers. And we see from both list experiments and explicit discussion that about a third are willing to say they actively sold their vote. In addition to being a patronage democracy, these communities are marked by extreme gender-based inequalities in resources. So I'm just going to present a few gender gaps here, but essentially to note, the gender gap in education is closing rapidly, but still persists among older generations. For example, in the communities that I work, about 90% of women are illiterate, and there still are large gender inequalities in access to higher levels of education. Labor force participation is strikingly low for women. Only 22% of women are in the labor force, as compared to about 75% of men. And of those who are in the labor force, women have much higher unemployment rates. We also see that about a quarter of women are married by the age of 18, and the average age of marriage for women is about 20. So this is just an area where there's really strong and persistent gender inequalities. But there's also really strong and persistent patriarchal norms and laws and attitudes. So this is data from a survey that we can corroborate with other surveys that shows the share of men and women that report more gender unequal or gender regressive attitudes. So more than 60% of women and men are willing to say openly in a survey that men make better political leaders, that men have more rights to jobs and education, that men make better executives. In fact, if you look at this from the World Values Survey, South Asia and India in particular is the region of the world with the strongest patriarchal attitudes, more so than the Middle East and North Africa. And this goes even further. So, for example, again, through explicit questioning, 55% of women are explicitly willing to say that it is acceptable under some conditions for a husband to beat their wife. And that's even a higher proportion than men who are willing to state that. And about a third of women are willing to openly report in surveys that they've experienced domestic violence. So this is just a very strong patriarchal society. Now, just to spend a little bit more time talking through the argument, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because there's a lot of data, and I think that's maybe a more fun place to sit and spend our time. But I'm going to argue that households make political decisions jointly. Not all households, but many households make political decisions jointly and are the fundamental unit of politics. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that households, in the same way that we bargain over how to spend money, over how to invest our resources, also rationally bargain over who to vote for and how to engage in politics, what demands to make. Now, they also, as a household, have the capacity, there is the capacity for coercion, where threat or violence can be used within the household. In fact, I just gave you a statistic that it's not unlikely. In fact, a third of women report explicit violence in the household, and even more report things like threats or fear. And so when I mean coercion, what I mean is both explicit violence, threats, coercion, like the things that we think of when we think of coercion, but I also mean the subtle enforcement of normative roles that would generate an internalization of subordination. So if we think about a political economy framework, what I really mean is that your option set is one. You don't have free choice. You can only imagine one choice. And that's the choice that, someone else or some other normative system has constrained you to. And so those with bargaining power, i.e. resources, and those with coercive power, which is determined by these patriarchal norms, but also laws that either protect or don't prosecute when there are things like coercion happening, those with those two sources of power can dominate all household decision-making, including political decision-making. Now, this is how political decision-making in a household might operate through both bargaining and coercion, but why would a household cooperate politically? Well, first, because it might maximize the welfare of the household. So, for example, if households have some shared preferences, aligning on those shared preferences is going to increase the probability that outcome is going to be delivered, whether that's who you're voting for or whether that's I want the road in front of my house improved. If we all sort of agree on that, showing more support may increase the likelihood that road gets fixed. And while political preferences are diverse, we know that households often share preferences, both because you're sharing an existence. So things like a road are proximate to you. If you have children, you jointly care about the education system. We know that people marry or form households because they are often very similar to each other. But even more, the state itself enforces shared preferences among the household. The fact that ration cards or other welfare programs are given to households as opposed to individuals in many instances reinforces the households as a political unit. But in addition to maximizing the welfare of the household, political cooperation can also maximize the welfare of dominant individuals in the household, where if dominant individuals can ensure that their preferences are the one that everyone in the household demands together, then they're more likely to get what they want. But this goes even further. So in many of the interviews that I ended up conducting, one of the things that people would openly say to me is that when a broker comes to the house, they're like, well, I trade 5 votes here. In fact, some people even posted outside the door of their house how many votes you could get if you mobilize the household. So there was an explicit exchange of the household as a voting unit for clientelistic benefits. And so the fact that clientelism operates also reinforces that household as a political unit. And what you're also seeing here is that it's not just the individuals who are participating in politics that this could benefit, but the political elites that run this system. So politicians, if they only have to mobilize or buy 1 vote per household, that's going to make the cost of mobilization so much lower than if they have to target people individually. And so households form sort of the lowest group, the easiest group to mobilize. And so we see these incentives at all levels of power to maintain a system of household organization. Now, how is it that political participation would then get negotiated in the household? And so I argue that households weigh the costs of political participation, which I'm going to assume are pooled, meaning that if we have to pay to go, get access to something or take transportation, or if we need to, we're losing all the free time from everyone who would participate, all of those sorts of costs, but also weigh the benefits to each member's participation. And if the marginal returns to more than one person participating in politics are increasing, meaning the more of us that show up, the better off we're going to be, the benefits outweigh the costs, then what we're going to see is multiple household members participating. But if instead the marginal returns to more people participating are diminishing, what we're going to see is a political division of labor, where someone in the household acts as the political representative of the household, advocating for the interests that everyone would go together to advocate for anyways, because you're already coordinating, cooperating. And I'm going to suggest that the person who ends up being the political representative is the person who has more power in the household, both coercive and bargaining, but also the lowest cost to participation, of which you can imagine that's also probably gendered. And so you can probably start to see the explanation for the dual gender gaps emerging. That in voting, there is a benefit to everyone in the household, including the head of the household, for more people showing up at the ballot box and voting. But when it comes to many forms of non-electoral participation, such as a public meeting, having everyone from the household show up in the space isn't going to change the likelihood that you get heard by that much more. But instead, the cost of having all those people show up could be much higher. And so often what we see is that dominant men, meaning men in the household with more power, often act as the political agent of households. And one of the things I'm going to show you is that this doesn't just impact women, but it also impacts younger men. And so when we think about this beyond one household, what does that mean for politics? So it means that we would see no gender gap in voter turnout, but that women have imperfect autonomy over their vote choice. We would see a gender gap in costlier forms of political participation, but that the women who do have autonomy from the household, or the women who have more bargaining power in their household, are more likely to participate in politics. We also see coordination of household demand making, which means that the kinds of things we would see emerging in political discourse are preferences and interests that are shared by the household, shared at the identity group, the identity group that defines households, which in India is going to be caste, as well as men interests being privileged, and we're going to see an underrepresentation of women's specific gendered interests. And then finally, we're going to see a broader organization of politics around identities that are shared at the household level. And then ultimately, we're going to see a system of clientelism and mobilization that centers on the household. Now, just to finish again with a little bit of a positive story, if we know what makes up the status quo, it becomes easier to understand how we might change it. And so if women's participation is constrained, as I've argued, by essentially a few things: inequalities in resources that lead to inequalities in bargaining power, socially and legally sanctioned male coercive power, that leads to resistance from male power holders, essentially vested interests in women's subordination. We would expect that women are likely to participate when either they get more power in the household and less coercion. That's possible but difficult. We've seen that through structural change in various societies across the world. But it could also happen when women gain autonomy from the household and the ability to credibly contest that resistance, which I'm going to argue collective action enables. But collective action has high transaction costs. And so I've described this society where women are isolated, they themselves have internalized patriarchal attitudes, how do you actually see collective action among women emerging when it has these high transaction costs? Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that women need to share interests and share networks outside of the household. They need to have the ability to share information with each other such that they could actually collectively act. So we're likely to see collective action when the information costs among women are lower, when they've identified shared political demands, i.e. a reason to collectively act, such that they can bargain to collectively act more easily, but also when they have trust and solidarity and a shared sense of identity so that they can enforce collective action because everyone there is more likely to show up. This is closer to our understanding of social capital. And so I'm gonna try and prove all of this to you in the context of one state in India, the state of Madhya Pradesh. It's the one that is circled here in yellow. It's a state that's in the center of the country. It's geographically quite large, like all of India. It's got, several 100 million people in the state. It is a part of the central belt of India, known as the Hindi belt or the Bimaru region. It's an area of India that has some of the lowest socioeconomic outcomes. It's one of the poorest regions, and as you see here, also has some of the worst outcomes for women. So what I'm plotting here in this map is the share of women that report going to these public meetings that I keep mentioning. The darker the color, the lower the share. Very dark. And just a little bit more on that data and the methodologies. I'll get to the methodologies as we go through them. I'm going to leverage a few things. So the first is the census that I mentioned in 6 villages. And the reason that we did this census was to be able to understand networks. So how did this work? Well, we went into these 6 villages, a team of people that had been working there for a while, and we built a rapport with the community. But we took in all of the voter rolls. Everyone who's registered to vote is published online. And as I've already showed you, about 99% of people vote. So we knew that gave us a pretty good sense of who was in these communities. But we conducted a series of focus groups, about 10 focus groups in each village, with different communities in the village to make sure that we had fully enumerated all of not just the households, but the people. And this was really important because particularly for young women who have just married into the community, something I should mention is that this is an area where patriarchality is the norm, meaning that at marriage, women move in with their husband and his family. And so when young women enter, they're often denied their name. And so it took us a long time to even be able to identify and name all of the women in these communities. And so these focus groups helped us do that. We then attempted to survey everyone that we had enumerated, and we were successfully able to reach 93%, a pretty high response rate. And of the 7% that we couldn't reach, 87% of that 7% was because either they had failing health or had migrated out of the village for a sustained period of time. In this survey, the goal again was to measure networks, and so we did this using name generators, which meant that we asked respondents to name up to 5 people in their village, including their household, and that prime was given, with whom they discuss politics, and separately with whom they spend their free time and socialize. And because we have the whole list of everyone, they could just tell us the names, and we stored the name in the survey itself, and then we could match that to the data that we'd collected from those people themselves. Additionally, I've mentioned this other survey. This one happened previously in 2016, where I sampled 15 women and half of their husbands in about 376 villages. Villages were sampled based on stratifying across the arbitrary interventions I'm going to discuss later so that we could estimate the effects from those natural experiments. And so a lot of the data I'm going to present today comes from 76 pure control villages so that we're not conflating some of the subsequent estimates. And then additionally, in between these two things, we did these 200 interviews with randomly sampled women. Now, these were women that were sampled from census rosters that we received from the government. And then we surveyed their husband, and this was in 20 villages. These interviews were conducted by trained research associates who knew the local language. One thing I also haven't mentioned is the communities that I work in are disproportionately tribal in population. And so they're from indigenous communities of India. These are called scheduled tribes. And so while most people speak Hindi, it's also not the most comfortable language. And so we had interviewers and enumerators who I trained to go in, but who also spoke these local languages so that the interviews could be done in as comfortable a way as possible. And they were done in private. I should make that very clear. Private with gender-matched enumerators. The interviews were recorded. They were then transcribed and translated. And then from there, some undergraduate research assistants double-coded them using a coding scheme that I iteratively developed. So here's where we're going to go. We're going to start with description. I'm going to describe household political behavior and how this correlates with political participation. I'm also going to describe the gendered structure of political organization more broadly. And then we're going to go into evaluation. And I'm going to provide evidence evaluating the impact of women's groups on women's political participation, as well as the impact of a gender consciousness raising program on women's political participation. So, are women politically tied to the household? That's sort of one of the core questions that we started with, that households cooperate, but that women in particular are tied and attached to the household. And so I'm going to present some data from the network survey, the census survey that I've mentioned. And I'm going to start by having you just look at the right side of this graph. So on the left part of this is men, and on the right part is women. And this is the average number of political ties that men and women report. So on average, men report discussing politics with 1.75 other people, and women report discussing politics with about 0.75 other people. No, sorry, just over one other person. So we see that there's a gender gap in political discussion. Men report discussing politics with more people than women do. But this isn't because women are fundamentally less connected than men. If we look instead at social networks, what we see is that women report spending more time socializing with more people than men do. We can go one step further and we can think about, well, what share of the people with whom you discuss politics are from your household? And so red is the share that are from your household. And I'm just going to spend time over here for the rest of this. But what we see is that 40% of the people with whom women discuss politics are from their household, only 4% for men. We can go even further and we can think about, are you discussing politics with men or with women? And so the darker shades here reflect women. And so if we look at women, what we see is that within the household, women are discussing politics 50-50 between men and women in the household. But outside of the household, they're almost exclusively discussing politics with other women. When we look at men, they're only talking to men, and they're only talking to men outside of their household.
So what's the average size of a household in the sample?
So the average household size is about 5. Yeah. Now, and some of the reason these are deflated, you'll see in a second. There's a lot of people who say they discuss politics with no one, that they feel very isolated. So what we're seeing here is not just a gender gap in political network, but very different compositions of networks. But there's something lurking in this data. What's lurking is that these are the same people in the same village, right? So women think that they're talking to men about politics. They think they're talking to men in their households about politics. Men do not think they are talking to women in their household about politics. In fact, less than 1% of their connections are the women in their household. And so women do not register as political agents to men in the same way that men register as political agents to women. Now we can think more broadly about whether or not households cooperate in determining political behavior, and this gets a little bit, I'm going to answer Lorena's question here a bit more explicitly. But here what I have on the x-axis is many different forms of political participation. You can't read, I am sure, but we've got voting here. Then after voting, we've got attending meetings, contacting local representatives, attending party meetings, protest campaigns, etc. But pretty much everything from the second one over is non-electoral participation, and the first one is voting. On the y-axis, we have the number of people who participated in that activity from a household. And remember, I've talked to everyone, so I know everyone from the household. And I'm going to constrain this to only households where at least one person participated in these activities. For what it's worth, in all of the non-electoral activities, 90% of households had at least one person participate. For voting, it was like 100%. And the average household size is about 5.5. So what is the average number of people in a household who voted? Well, it's just under 5. So almost everyone, from the households that are voting, almost everyone is voting. But when we look at all of these other forms of political participation, we see that not everyone is participating in politics. And remember, I'm constraining to households where at least one person participated. So the minimum value is 1. A perfect political division of labor would mean only one person is showing up. But the way this question was asked is it was, have you ever in the last year done this activity? And so these are things that would happen very regularly. And so the fact that it's 1 to 2 people on average in a household, I think is a pretty clear indication of a household division of labor. We can overlay gender with this. The colors are flipped, unfortunately, so purple here means men. But what we see is that this is pretty much dominated by men, with the exception of voting, where we see 50-50. Now, why don't women participate? Here's what they say. So this is quantified data from the interviews and the coding process in those interviews. When asked why women didn't show up to public assembly meetings, the most common response that was given was because someone else from the household was already going. So why would they go? The second most common response was that they didn't have time, as well as that they had care work, and those in combination is also a pretty powerful response. But what I want to note is that there's a non-trivial share here that say they didn't participate because they weren't allowed to. So we also have active acknowledgement of coercion and repression of political behavior. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about voting, but I want to start giving you some of this in women's own words, and so I'm going to present a few quotes. But do households vote as a unit? That's part of this household cooperation. 75% of women and 2/3 of men in interviews stated that their households always vote the same way. Now, what do I mean by always vote the same way? So in the interview, we asked respondents that we want to know how you decide who to vote for, not who you voted for. So tell us how you decide who to vote for. And Anita says, we decide to vote for one person altogether. And if we decide to vote for Congress, one of the parties in India, then all of us will vote for Congress only. And so the interviewer pushes further. They say, has it ever happened that there was a disagreement? Like your mother-in-law says that she wants to vote for someone while your father-in-law wants to vote for someone else. Has that ever happened? And Anita says, no, it's never happened. And the interview probes even more. So then who decides for whom you'll vote? And Anita very quickly says, my father-in-law. The interview says, okay, but what if your best friend was running for office and you wanted to vote for them, but your husband didn't want you to vote for them? In fact, not even that they didn't want you to vote for them, they wanted to vote for someone else. What would you do? And Anita says, I'll listen to my husband. I will accept whatever my husband will say. My friend is only a friend, but my husband is my family. So this very strong norm that's being described of abiding by what the household wants. And we can see this in the data itself. I'm going to go back to that network data, where one of the questions that was asked of everyone is, who is involved in the decision over whom you vote for? And they listed everyone who is involved in the decision. And then of the people that was listed, including yourself, who has the most say over your vote choice? And if we focus just on the yellow bars here, that's the share of men on the left and the share of women who say that they have the most say over their vote choice. So about 60% of men and about 40% of women say that they have the most say over their vote choice. You see who has the most say? It's always other men in the family. Now, in some ways, this is surprising. It aligns with my theory that women have low autonomy over their vote choice, but it might be surprising that men also have fairly low autonomy. But if we disaggregate the data by age and look instead at people under the age of 40 and over the age of 40, what we see is that men over the age of 40 have almost complete autonomy over their vote choice, but that men under the age of 40 have about the same autonomy over their vote choice as women. It goes up for women with age, but not to the same extent that it goes up for men. Now, what is the result of all of this? How does this aggregate to the larger political network? So the beauty of census data is I can make really cool network graphs of villages. And so this is one of the villages in which we did this network survey. And so each dot is a person, and each line is a reported connection. You can't see it, but there are arrows showing you the direction of the connection. And already you see all of the isolated people. These are what we would call isolates. People who are not connected report no connections to anyone. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to remove them just so that you can see patterns a little bit easier, but it's actually fairly evenly distributed across men and women. So here is the network of one of the villages, the political network of the village. Now, these are the men, these are the women. You already start to see who occupies the center and who occupies the periphery. And if we put it together, it becomes abundantly clear. That density of ties in the middle is almost exclusively among men. And women are much more often in the periphery. In many cases, women are tied to one or two other people, often one or two other men. There are a few clusters, like up here, maybe down here, of women that are well connected to each other. But even these dense clusters of women exist on the periphery, while the dense clusters of men occupy the center. In fact, if anyone has taken a network methods class, we have many different ways of measuring your centrality to the network. I think it's pretty clear what those measures are going to pick up as to who is central to the network. Now, one thing I want to contrast this with is what if instead of gender, we look at caste, which is the most important other identity in rural India.
So, sorry, what was the yellow?
So the yellow are the people that we couldn't survey.
Okay.
So sometimes people that we couldn't survey were named by other people, and so they're included here. Yeah. So this is the network done by caste. Now, there are 3 different caste communities, but one of them is very small. The upper caste community is like 2 or 3 people. But the lighter green here are people from scheduled tribes or the indigenous populations. These darker colors are mostly people from what are called other backward castes, which are not quite upper castes, but they're a protected group of castes, but are also more economically dominant than scheduled tribes. But what you see very clearly is that connections are almost exclusively within caste. Whereas gender defines whether you're on the inside or the outside, caste determines who you're talking to. And in fact, if we think about those dense clusters of women, like here and here, these are women all from the same caste only talking to each other. And in fact, if you look at the measures of this, more than 90% of people's reported ties are with people from their same caste group. And so we see broader political organization around these identities that are shared at the household level. Okay. So where do we go from here? How do we challenge this patriarchal political order? The question that I'm going to ask is, does expanding women's ties outside of the household and building their autonomy and their ties to other women improve their political participation and their political agency? And I'm going to study what is now, at the time was not as big, but is now one of the largest initiatives, women's empowerment initiatives in India, that I think at this point has something like, 300 million women embedded within, are what are known as self-help groups. So self-help groups are essentially microcredit collectives, but unlike most common microfinance groups, they don't have an end date. They're not necessarily explicitly linked to banks. They're meant to be spaces where women meet regularly and decide how they're going to save financially and lend their money internally, but then also whether they want and when they want to get access to banks. But they're essentially groups of 15 to 20 women who meet usually weekly. In this case, the NGO that I worked with, these were weekly meetings that come together for savings and credit. These are economic groups. And that's important because the reason that women are allowed to join these groups is because they're seen as bringing benefits to the household. They're seen as bringing access to cheaper loans. But while you have these weekly meetings, and of course the first 30 minutes are spent having just conversations about finances, conversation can easily turn to things that are not just about finance. And so you can talk about the challenges that you're facing in life, your household. And the groups that I'm going to study have on average been together for more than 6 years. So it's important that this is a sustained intervention. For those of you who are in my experiments class right now, you can imagine why I chose to study this with a natural experiment instead of an experiment. 6 years of treatment would be a really hard thing to maintain and to justify. And so I'm going to study whether access to these self-help groups implemented by this NGO Prillaman increases women's political participation. Now, how am I going to study this? I'm going to leverage the fact that the NGO Prillaman that I worked with established an arbitrary boundary within which they could actually mobilize these groups. Beyond that boundary, and the travel distance would just be too hard for their staff to reach. And I'm going to compare communities just on either side of that boundary that should, in theory, be the same on both observable and unobservable characteristics to see whether the communities that had access to this self-help group program have more political participation among women than those that didn't. Now, just to make sure that these communities are the same, I'm going to pair match across the boundary with observable data that I have. And then I'm also, because I know who's in these self-help groups, I oversampled in the data collection process, I oversampled self-help group members in treated communities, in the communities that had the self-help groups. But, and I'm happy to talk about this more in Q&A, you might be concerned about whether that would induce some selection bias because the types of women who join these groups are different. I have lots of evidence to suggest that that's not true, but I'm also going to model selection into self-help groups to try to prove that that's not what's underlying the effects. So just to give you some of this more intuitively, this is one district in the state that I work in. The way that the NGO chose where to set up self-help groups is they chose a very remote location in that district because their goal was to serve the most underserved communities, and they set up their office in that location. They then determined what was the feasible boundary within which they could travel. This was on average about like 25 kilometers, but with really rough road conditions. And so within that boundary, they then chose some villages that they were going to provide self-help groups to. That means there are some villages just outside that boundary that didn't get these groups, but could have if the boundary had been wider. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pair match villages across this boundary that are the same on the characteristics that Prillaman says that they use to choose the villages that they go to get to the sample of villages that I'm going to study. And I'm going to compare those who are just across the border to estimate the effect of the program. So, and I'm going to use the data from that sample survey that I mentioned to estimate these effects. So this is why I chose the villages that I chose. 75 of them are inside the boundary and 75 of them are just outside the boundary. And they're in these matched pairs. I'm happy to talk through this, but just because lots of people are thinking about methods, I estimate the effects in several ways, but two primary ways. One is what's a typical geographic regression discontinuity specification with non-parametric functionality of geography. But then I think what's easier to interpret is I just use matched pair fixed effects so that I'm comparing within these matched pairs. Okay, so here are the main effects, and you see a couple of different estimators here. I'm going to really just have you focus on the black estimator because the gray one is a subsample to really prove to you that the modeling into selection doesn't matter. What we see is that women in self-help group communities reported a substantially greater amount of interest in politics, substantially more non-electoral participation when it's made into an index, when it's measured as attending those public meetings, making claims on local governments, or making claims on the second tier of government. But no different levels of voting or electoral behavior. Now, the size of these effects, while it might look small because these dots look really small on this, are actually quite large. It amounts to a doubling of the likelihood that a woman would show up to a meeting. And we can see how this also played out in the network. So this is the same mapped network in one of the villages that had these SHGs. And we see that men are still very central and very dominantly central, but the distribution of women looks a little bit different. The lighter pink are women who were members of the self-help group. And what we see is there's now this alternate dense cluster of women emerging on the periphery with strong and well-connected ties to each other. And in fact, in the communities where self-help groups existed, we see that their reported networks look very different. Now, why did these groups matter? I'm going to argue that it was mostly because they allowed women to have spaces to organize collective action. And a lot of the evidence for this, though not all of it, comes from the interviews. So in 80% of the interviews, self-help group members stated that they had coordinated to attend a village assembly meeting together. Meaning, the way they talked about this is we call each other up or we go door to door and we make sure everyone goes together. And if a husband is trying to keep someone, we make sure that she gets to go. And 60% said that they had collectively mobilized in some other way. So here's an example of how one woman described it. We have done many things in this village. We have solved issues for children in the village. We've also fought for the prohibition of alcohol, which is linked to issues of domestic violence. A new team from our self-help group has been formed on the issue of intoxication. If women are being beaten or harassed by men, then we help them. We go to the local government together. Wherever there is an issue, all we sisters go there collectively. Now, you might be worried, though. I'm arguing that this is about collective action, but I told you that these groups are fundamentally economic in nature. So might it simply be that women got richer, their households got richer, and so now they have more resources? Well, what we find is that there was not a big impact on women's economic resources, and so that doesn't seem to be a likely mechanism. Now, we can go even one step further to really see whether this is about collective action or whether this is about resources. And we can look at the impact of a gender program or a gender consciousness raising program meant to stimulate greater solidarity among women that in theory would translate to more collective action. And as I've mentioned, collective action is costly. So the idea here was seeing whether raising the salience of gender and fostering group solidarity enhanced women's collective action and ultimately their political participation. And so what I did was I leveraged the fact that the same NGO in different communities, these are not the same villages that we studied in the last set of slides, was implementing a pilot program funded by UN Women to implement new gender consciousness raising trainings that were designed by a feminist organization over the course of 3 years. So each self-help group went through 8 to 10 trainings over 3 years. Now, the challenge is that this was a pilot program. This was not randomized. So the communities that got these trainings were not necessarily the same as those that didn't. But I know how they chose which communities to give this to because I know this NGO very well. And we spent a lot of hours sitting in rooms together. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare these self-help group members in villages that received the program with self-help group members in villages that did not receive the program. And what I know about this is that the ones that received the program received it because the mobilizer from the NGO wanted to do this. They felt really empowered to do this. And so I'm going to compare within the same mobilizer the places where they implement this and didn't implement this. I'm also going to compare where mobilizers got dropped and didn't get dropped. I'm going to compare districts. So we just have a lot of different ways of doing these comparisons, including ways of instrumenting for which places they chose to go to. I'm happy to talk about all the specifics of that, but there's just a lot of different statistical models that are used to try to really get at unconfoundedness. So what is the main effect? Well, I'm going to start by focusing down here. These are all of our non-electoral political participation, and we see large and positive significant effects. In fact, this is another doubling. So a doubling from the original. So it's like a 50% increase from the new one. So if we started at 25% of women attending village meetings, 50% of self-help group members attend village meetings, 75% of women who receive this program in their self-help group attend village meetings. In fact, the gender gap disappears after this program. But it's also important to note, and this will come back up in a second, that we see a diminishment in women's reported interest in politics. So why did this have such a positive effect on women's political participation? So one aspect of this is that it helped build a consciousness around gender inequality. So one woman talks about this. She says, the role of men in our society is the same as it was before. Men are always ahead, and so nobody says anything to them. They always comment on women only in terms of their failures. Earlier, women didn't have the courage to go out of their house and tell somebody about their sorrow. They used to get beaten at home, and they used to sit at home. Earlier, I faced many restrictions. Then I gradually became fearless. Men always consider women as wrong. They say, why would women go there? What is their need? When men are already there, why would women go to the public meeting? That's what the Gram Sabha is. Many men think like that. People from our villages think like that. But now, some people are starting to understand it a bit. We don't listen to anyone, and now we do whatever we want to do. So a growing consciousness around the barriers and constraints that were present all along. Now, additionally, what we see is that this changed the nature of political mobilization. And this is going to be really small and it's going to be hard to see, but I'm just going to go to the end and show you that the blue are the control communities. The pink are the treated communities. I think this is right. That's not quite right. Essentially, the takeaway from this, we're going to go there, is that the women who'd received this gender consciousness raising program were more likely to demand two things. They were more likely to demand water and public goods that are often associated with women, but they were also more likely to demand protection from violence. And in fact, I'm going to come back to this in a second because which thing they demanded shaped what response they received. And so overall, in addition to these very positive effects, we also see an increase in backlash in these communities. What we see is no difference in reported levels of domestic violence, but that could be because of competing effects of increasing violence and increasing reporting. But what we see is more women reporting that a male family member humiliated them in public spaces, and that public shaming increased. Men were more likely to threaten women in public spaces, and in fact, the practice of throwing stones at women became more popular. And so here is an example of how this is described by one woman. It used to be that we learned about the Gram Sabha, that's this public meeting. We learned that it was happening from the men in the village where the government office is, but they stopped telling us. And I said to them, why do you take women to campaign with you for the local government election? But when we're going for a meeting, you say things like, is it that all the men of the village are dead? Is that why women are going? I would say, is it only the men that have elected the local leader? The government is made for everyone. When I speak, my fellow SHG women asked, aren't you afraid? They are afraid that they're going to be defamed. Some women thought that I'm involved in politics and that I'm a very dangerous woman. I said, yes, I am a dangerous woman. I am doing politics. I don't mind saying such things because I know that we should discuss these things in our group and we shouldn't feel bad about it. But some men tell such things to our husbands, then they don't tolerate and they tell us to stop going to these meetings. These are the problems that we face. So what we see here is a description of many different forms of backlash. Women being denied access to the information they would previously get. We see men in the households of empowered women being socially sanctioned for their wives being out of control and not doing what they're supposed to, and then women receiving the sanctioning within the household. So there are costs as well to men in the household. But we also see a desire to challenge that resistance. And I think that was an important part of this, because it seems even here that there's a discussion of resistance as sort of a necessary challenge when you are experiencing this. Now, just to go back to what women wanted, this backlash was more common in communities where women wanted protection from violence. When women were seen as bringing development to the community, their presence in political spaces wasn't as threatening, and it wasn't seen as a challenge to power. But as soon as women wanted a change to power institutions, we see more of this backlash. So what does all of this say? What I hope I've convinced you of is that women's exclusion is the outcome of an entire political system that often maximizes men's welfare. And what's distinct in this answer from the answers we've had in the past is that there's no individual thing that you could target to an individual woman that is necessarily going to make it easier for her to gain access to politics, that this is a systemic issue that involves systemic responses. And so we can think of what this means for how we get to inclusion. So a few pathways become clear. We could imagine reducing the coercive power that men have by changing norms or instituting laws. We could think about changing the incentives for coercion by changing politics. If clientelism were less prevalent, would we see less incentive for men to enforce cooperation of the household? But what I've really focused on here is how change can happen from the bottom up and how women can exert their own agency to demand change by achieving autonomy from the household and challenging these systems through their own self-mobilized collective action. Now, what are the implications for all of this? I think there are implications for our understanding of women's political behavior, but also that to really understand governance and systems of governance, we have to understand women's political behavior and why it operates the way it does. But that also, when we think about patronage democracies, we very rarely collect data from women. We most often collect data from heads of households just because it's easier. And what I hope this suggests is that we might be missing an important part of the story, and that patronage systems and clientelism may be built on the exclusion of women. And finally, what I hope this implies and convinces you of is that reducing the gender gap in political participation isn't just about changing presence in political spaces, because women show up at the ballot box, but it's about changing agency and the ability to act on that agency. And so ultimately, I hope that this shapes our understanding of how norms, institutions, social capital, resources all come together to uphold unequal political orders. And so thank you so much for listening to me for so long. I really look forward to all your comments and questions.
Thank you, Soledad. It was really, really, really awesome. Just a first question. How long does it take for you to get all this data and all this research done?
That's a mean answer because it might seem. Well, so I started this project in 2014.
Okay.
So about a decade.
No, yeah.
But what I can say is that, remember there was a pandemic in that decade.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Not a representative sample of time. And all of the data collection was done prior to that.
Okay.
So everything, all the data collection was done.
Yeah, perhaps.
Oh, microphone. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, guys. So we open to the floor. If you have questions, commentaries, and so on. Usually we start with students, but that's our norm here. Okay, Bruno, you have a question? Okay, so let's start. Come over here. You must stay on the mic.
Hello, Soledad. My name is Bruno. I'm a PhD candidate, ABD, here at the department. Thanks for your presentation. My question is kind of silly because I know you don't have the time to explain everything. But just for curiosity, when you showed that graphic, the pairwise of the households, how did you do to
This one?
yeah, this one, to guarantee the assumption of the stable unit treatment for each unit? Because I don't know, maybe in the connections, one woman could be a friend of another woman from the other one, and just make sure the suit assumption, just for curiosity.
Not a silly question, and also reveals that I could have been clear. So a few things to answer to that. So the first is that these are villages, and so the level of treatment assignment is at the village level. And so I'm going to assume that everyone within a community that had SHGs is treated for most of the estimates. Even though we know that not everyone joined the self-help group, we could estimate differential effects for those who did, and everyone who didn't was in control. So that takes care of some of it because it's at this higher level. And I mean, the truth is, I can tell you from the survey, 80% of women said they had not left their village boundary in a year. So I think that already proves that there's not likely to be a spillover. That said, I didn't know that when I started this, so I was worried about it. And so what I did was any village that was within 1 kilometer of the boundary was excluded from the analysis, because the assumption was if you were, which gives a 2 kilometer sort of wiggle room, that would hopefully minimize the likelihood that people would talk to each other. Yeah.
Okay. Next question. Okay.
There is a huge gender gap here at the University of São Paulo in terms of top of career. Of course, women less in worse position than women. So do you believe that the mechanism is the same, or because the correlation? What is your thought on that?
Yeah. So how might, just to generalize this, how might the explanation for a gender gap in politics translate to a gender gap in, say, top positions in a university, top positions, corporate executives, other fields? I think that the specific part about households is probably not operating, though maybe even to some extent. Like, for example, this is pure speculation. I'm going to just jump out and say that. I don't have data to support this. But, we know often that that the decision over what jobs you take is something that's made at the household level, because often it involves some amount of collaboration, some amount of compromise. And so if you imagine that heads of households have more power in asserting their authority at every point in the career cycle, that would probably shape many of the factors that would lead to the known leaky pipeline of women from positions of authority in economic spaces. So that's one way where this might be similar, is thinking about how households structure decisions and how those decisions have unintended consequences for gender gaps in other spaces. I think the other part that might be very similar here, and I can speak now instead of from a perspective of a researcher, but the perspective as a woman in academia. But when I interview or do focus groups, I spend a lot of time meeting with self-help groups. I've sat in a lot of self-help group meetings. And at the end, I would always ask them if they had a question for me. And the first question was always about farming, because these are economic groups and they really wanted to understand farming outside of India. But the second question, almost always, was, what does my women's group look like? And I reflected on that a lot, because while I have friends, I don't have an institutionalized group that could help me demand access to higher levels of spaces, or even if it's not about demanding access, to navigate all the challenges. I would imagine that if you plotted the network of many corporations, you would see that even where there are women, they may have fewer connections. And connections mean information. They mean access. And so I do think that there are some similarities in terms of what might underlie those differences, being things like access to people in power, how power is structured in households, how power is structured in institutions, and the incentives of those who have power to maintain those existing power structures. It's not easy, and I don't say this with any malice. It makes a lot of sense, but if you have power and someone wants some of it, it's going to be really hard to just voluntarily give that up. And so how do you change that? I think there's something about creating and having solidarity among women is as important as a way to fill some of those gaps. And just the very last thing I'll say on this, that's another thing about how politics might translate elsewhere, is that I've described backlash as one way of resisting women's demands for power. I have a current study that looks at the agency of women elected representatives. So these are women who've made it into office. I should note that in India, half of the mayoral seats are reserved for women. So we have a huge number of women in elected office. And so you might think, well, that's going to fix this problem, right? So we've gone and we've done some measurement. Qualitative interviews and like spending a lot of time in the field revealed this term called Pati Sarpanch, which means husband mayor. The idea is that even when the woman is the mayor, the person you'd go to is their husband to get things done. So we're trying to measure how common that is. Again, it's like the same idea, the household co-opting agency of women in politics. And we see that in 70% of these villages that are run by a woman, in fact, if you ask the woman herself who has the most say over the decisions of her job, she says it's my husband or some male family member. If you ask citizens who you should go to if you need a benefit, they say go to the husband, not the woman who's the elected representative. Now, why did I bring this up? It is a very circuitous route. But backlash is one strategy to resist demands for power or change of power structures. The other is co-optation, finding ways to divert women's demand making or to take that power back. And one of the things I heard very regularly is that these women's groups would find that many men would start to tell them, particularly for the groups that crossed caste boundaries, why would you let this person from the other caste talk to you? Can you believe what that caste group is doing? And trying to sow divisions among women that would then make collective action less likely. And we see this at larger scales, that it's very, very hard to sustain a widespread political movement of women. There are very few women's parties in the world, in the same way that we know there are lots of ethnic parties. And I think that those challenges might also exist in other spaces where it becomes women competing with each other for power as opposed to jointly demanding power. And so I say all of that to say that while I think there might be a similarity of solidarity as being a pathway to change, it's a really hard thing to achieve, and I think maybe even a harder thing in institutions where things like money are like actively being traded as the form of power.
Okay. Do.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. It was really, really interesting and really convincing. But I'm going to ask you an unfair question.
Great.
Because it's not exactly inside your research, but it's to extrapolate a little bit from actually Amansio's question also extrapolated a lot, but I'm extrapolating for the whole India. So you presented very convincing arguments about the engine of patriarchy in Indian politics, but I don't know, 40% of the Indian population is in very large cities, and other 30% is in mid-sized cities, and the rest is in this kind of villages. So how this thing plays out in a large city, or dilutes or not, because this is it has to do also with Brazil. You are going to find much more clientelism and vote control and patriarchy in the rural areas than in large cities.
Yeah, I think it's an entirely fair question, and in some ways I have some answers to it, and in some ways I think that's when I said that while this is done, there's more to come, that's part of that more to come. So one answer I have is that maybe I'll start with the caveat. The challenge here is that very few large-scale surveys have collected data on anything other than voting from women. Almost every one of our big, large public opinion surveys either doesn't include a lot of women or only asks, did you vote? And so that already leaves me unable to answer the question. So there's a huge data constraint that I think is just important to acknowledge. There is one survey that was done once that asked women whether they attended these public meetings from across the country. It also asked them whether they were members in self-help groups. I don't, however, have data on vote agency. That no one is asking. But what I can say is that when you look across the country, you see the same trend that SHG membership does increase political participation, and you see the same gender gap in non-electoral participation in a lot of the country, including in urban areas. Now, that said, I do think there are important differences, and I think some of those differences are maybe not explained by this model because the forms of political participation look differently, and I think some of them are. So, if clientelism is less prevalent, we might see things change. If gender norms look different, we might see different things. There are certainly parts of the country that have very different laws that would protect women from some of this coercion in different spaces. And so it's not going to be identified in the same way that I can with a smaller study, but I'm working right now to do a survey with 10,000 women from across the country, from 10 different states, to understand and just map how prevalent is this. I have some pilot data from only 2 of those states, one in the north, Uttar Pradesh, that's near to MP, where this study is, and one from Tamil Nadu, which is known as having some of the most progressive gender attitudes. And what you see so far is 2 things. One is that there is a big difference in these patterns, in that we see a lot more vote agency and a lot more political participation in Tamil Nadu than we see in UP. But when you try to get to the roots of that by understanding, if your husband would be mad at you for doing this, for example, we see almost identical behavior. So we can start to tease out some of those mechanisms. I don't yet have a sample from urban areas, so I can't speak to that, but I'm looking actually at that in Pakistan, where things look a little different. But in fact, women's mobility is more constrained in urban areas. You don't leave a lot of spaces in Pakistan. In fact, there are these hallways built so that you never have to go outside. And we've created women's groups that are receiving training because they don't exist there to see whether it has the same effect. All to say TBD. But what I can say is one other thing that's not quite an answer, but maybe of interest, is that many of you may be thinking about intersectionality. That's a big question that comes up in issues of gender. I haven't presented much of that. It's something I spend a lot of time thinking about. And you could imagine that that's another place where these dynamics would differ. What was shocking to me is that it doesn't. That it looks exactly the same across caste groups, across ages, for the most part, across socioeconomic background. There's very little difference. And I was particularly surprised because I didn't give you a lot of background on the particular tribal community that is in these areas, but it's a tribal community known for having more progressive gender norms. It's a community where childbirth out of wedlock is acceptable. Women are allowed to have multiple partners. All of those things are common, though eroding over time as politics reaches these communities, as a more Hindu politics reaches. But even so, you still don't see differences across this. And in some interviews, you see elder women bemoaning some of the change in these practices. So I think my expectation is that there will be interesting and important and explainable differences that are useful for validating this, but also probably some surprising similarities where you have similarities in things like norms and constraints.
Another question? So you first, then Lorena, then me.
Hi, great presentation. I'm curious whether the research explored variation of women's participation across different issue areas of the household of the household policy agenda. I don't know, maybe in children care and education, women could be more allowed to express their opinions, and this could have some spread effect on other issues. Thank you.
It's
Maybe you can just
take a
join-
few. Sure.
Take a few, Lorena, just.
Yeah, well, it's actually related to what you said.
Great.
So it actually, what, so Sole, I have a question. If we can go back, actually, you know your bar chart here? I want this bar chart, the public,
Yeah.
yes? Yes, yes. Okay, so going back to this story, right?
Yeah.
And I think going to the literature that we're talking about, when we think about and we contrast it with the literature on women and women's participation, the story that we usually hear when we study industrialized democracies and we study even Latin America is the way to empower women into politics is through labor markets. And labor markets, women enter first the labor force, and that gives them autonomy, and that gives them agency, and that is when you really see political mobilization. Yes? I think it's fascinating, the story that you're saying about kind of thinking about in the context of rural India, but there's several things that are going on that when you showed this chart, it made me think a little bit about the labor market story, because you're talking about also farming. So if I'm kind of curious if you can walk us through the figure and tell us what's happening in the village. I can't work, right? I can't go to the labor market because women are unemployed. There's no labor market for me. If I want water and roads. So I'm guessing the story is something is about farming, and I need the water to grow my crops. Yes?
No.
Okay, I'm speculating. And so when women are identifying what are the most important problems, you put this slide and you said this talk and you said public goods and protection, which is really interesting. Going back, another thing, talking about the literature in women and what they demand, because the literature that we show is that once women gain the labor market, then they also demand pensions, they demand health care, and they demand other goods. But what is the story here going on about in the women that are treated? How do you explain, because it seems like they're demanding goods that are not benefiting themselves, it's benefiting the household, and maybe not really changing the negotiating capacity of the woman inside the household.
Yeah.
So I'm interested if you can kind of
Talk through it.
walk us through that.
Yeah. So I'm going to take these two, and
Yeah,
I'm going to
yeah,
go
that's okay.
backwards just because I'm on this slide, but I promise I will get to your question too. So first, before I talk through this, I want to say that I mentioned that women's labor force participation in India is really low at like 22%. What I didn't mention is that has declined over the last decade by 10 percentage points.
Well.
So 10 years ago, women were in the labor market at 30%. It's one of the biggest questions occupying the minds of both policymakers, economists, and honestly, like the US government right now, because this is seen as like diminishing the value of the economy. But it's also part of what motivates me here is, you're right, the story in most of the world is that women gaining access to labor markets means that then they gain access to politics. And what we're seeing is that women are being pulled away from labor markets. And so does that just resign us? Like, is it all done at that point? And in fact, I think the opposite is what's happening. In India, and I think it aligns with this story, which is that the explanation for why women's labor force participation is declining is still being studied, but the common explanation is that norms are now more binding. Families have a bit more money, and patriarchal norms are so strong that now they can pull women out of the labor force, and they don't need women to work. And yet, there were several consequential state elections in November, and we have a big national election in India coming up in April, and women are the center point of this election. For the first time, while I've mentioned that there are reserved seats for women in local office, There are no quotas for women in national office. That has come up as a bill in India for the last 30 years. It's come up something like 10 times. It was passed in October. It won't be implemented till 2029, but it was passed in October. The number of schemes that are now targeting women explicitly, providing cash subsidies, it is seen right now as women are the pivotal voters. And I think that it's a function of the fact that I told you that 300 million women are now members of these self-help groups. And so now it's actually easier to mobilize those votes through this institution than it is to go mobilize through your existing clientelist structure. It's also cheaper to do it that way. And so I say all of that to say that I think the journey, the overarching journey of women's political empowerment. Yeah, I'm shrinking.
Yeah, you don't know what's happening. Yeah. The chair is just. She's disappearing. Something happened. Sorry, but
for not.
Exactly.
You're not allowing me to just shrink away. So I do think there's something different, fundamentally different, happening across India. And what's interesting is that trajectory on labor force participation is urban and rural, not just rural. Now, what is happening in these communities? So the blue bars here are like the dark blue are the women the control women from this first study. The middle blue are the treated women from the first study who are the same as the control women in the second study. And the light blue are the treated women in the new study. The blue is just what women say is the biggest problem in the village. The pink is what these self-help groups are mobilizing around. That's what they're collectively acting towards. So what do we see that women think are the biggest issues? Well, the number one is water. Now, this is water collection. So there is no piped water in many of these communities. So you have to go to a water pump to collect it. Who do you think does that? Women do. In many of these communities, you're walking a very long distance, and it takes hours of your day. So what they want more than anything are more water pumps so that they can have more free time, because in fact, their days are very busy. The reason it's not about farming is that women, while they don't work officially in the way that we would count it as work, when a family owns a plot of land, women would help do a lot of the nimble work on that plot of land. But the way the norm works in these communities is that the money from the land goes to the people who plow the land, and women are not allowed to plow. And so that's not considered work. So they are spending a lot of time doing that, but they don't necessarily get the benefit of having that apart from survival. Roads is just something that is such a big issue, and it's just become a big issue. And so men also want a lot of roads. It's access to the outside, but it's also how you get goods in. And so that's just it's also a big government scheme. So I think that's part of what's going on with roads. Now, you're right, they also are upset about unemployment. Now, here, I think what's happening in most of this is that India has the largest welfare program in the world. It is called Narega, where anyone living in India is guaranteed 100 days of work provided by the government at minimum wage. And women avail of this more often than men because minimum wage is something they're more willing to accept. And this is work that exists within the village itself. But this has become one of the most corrupted programs. The money has run out. And so a lot of women aren't getting access to this. So when it says unemployment, I think what it really means is Narega work. And then they're also talking about governance, meaning they're mad at the corruption. They're mad at the fact that they can't get their Narega work. So in fact, I think a lot of what they say they want is gendered and specific to the challenges that women face, some of which is tied to labor markets. What they demand when they collectively mobilize is water and protection. In fact, when you ask women how important is protection from violence, how big a problem is, it's not actually one of the things that's most commonly named. And so I think it's quite telling that that's what binds women together when they collectively act, even if it's not what they articulate as the biggest problem. And we could, imagine why that might be what they articulate, or why it might not be. But because I think this ties into the next question, so here is, if we look at just the most important problem between men and women, this is a different survey. This is the census survey with slightly different categories. we see things like housing, we still see water as really important for women, whereas for men we see things like access. So on the left, the dashed line is the minimum distance, meaning you have perfectly identical preferences. On the far right is the maximum difference. What we see is a really wide distribution that's closer to the maximum distance than it is to the minimum distance. Not something I've studied, but there's in fact a study in Pakistan by someone who showed that it's the households with the more distant preferences where women are more likely to defer their voice in politics to their husband. Where when asked, whose preferences do you want to send to the government, they would send their husband's preferences. And they do that even when the researcher offers to pay them to send their own preferences. 70% of the time, they'll still send their husband's preferences. So I think that starts to get at this question. We could imagine that some spaces are safer for women to engage in and talk in. I think there's a little bit of evidence qualitatively to that. For example, a lot of these self-help group members end up on water committees within these communities because that's seen as something that is acceptable. But I do still have a hard time imagining how much this would shape things like political discussion in the household when only 1% of, like less than 1% of women are seen as even being relevant political actors. And so I think some of what's happening there is what women think of as issues are not seen as politics to men. Water is not seen in the same way as a political issue to men as it is to women. When asked, who do you discuss politics with? I think they're thinking about, who do I discuss who I'm going to vote for? Who do I discuss who has power? The way that you and I probably think about politics. But when you ask women what discussing politics is, it's, how do I get water from the government? It's very local. It's less about power and it's more about services. And so I say all of that to say, I don't know the answer to the question, but I do think that it's a little bit of the story that even some domains, like it would just be relegated to women, but not seen as political.
Okay. More questions? Commentaries? Oh. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to make one. I believe it's a side question, actually. You almost did not mention political parties at all. Did they have any role on this? Because I think they just mirror the system. I believe it's going to be harder for women to take part into a party for candidates. How does it operate within this contest?
Yeah.
Do you know?
I have some thoughts on this. I'll also say that I kind of intentionally avoided thinking a lot about party politics, just because it's already a complicated story. And because in this state in India, you're not allowed to have parties in local politics. So local elections are nonpartisan. That doesn't mean they're nonpartisan, but they're supposed to be nonpartisan. And so there's also less attachment of individuals to party. So where I have looked at it is I've looked at who do you vote for? And what we see, my argument would suggest that men and women should be voting for the same party. Because if households are coordinating, we shouldn't see the gendered party differences that we see in many other places. I don't know if I have it here. No, I don't have it here. But it's not really the case. They pretty much all vote for the same party.
Okay.
The difference in that graph is that 25% of women state that they don't remember who they voted for. And so you do see less reporting of voting for the BJP, which is the far-right party in India that's also in power nationally. But that's traded off not with more voting for Congress, which is the sort of like left party. It's traded off with not remembering who they vote for. Okay. I do think, though, that parties are now a bigger part of the story than they were when this study was done. Because at the time, like women were mentioned by parties almost never. And I think that's because of what I was documenting here. They didn't need to be. They weren't seen as political actors. And in the last 12 months, that's changed fundamentally. Some of the parties have instituted their own quota for women in party committees and party institutions. We're seeing, in fact, when I wrote the conclusion to this book, I was able to spend a bit of time looking at that. And I read a bunch of news articles. And what you see is that politicians are now going to SHG meetings to mobilize votes. And part of that is like these SHGs, I mentioned this earlier, they're more organized than a lot of local governance. You can reach them and they're seen as more trustworthy and less corrupt than a lot of local governments. But also, you can now go and convince them. And so I think it's so new, we don't know the answers of what's happening, but I think it builds on, there's a larger literature that's emerging in the study of gender and politics, mostly at the moment in Western Europe, but that shows that when there is a strategic incentive for parties to target women, we see increases in women's turnout, increase in women's political participation. And I think that's some of what we're seeing now. There's strategic value to women as voters, which essentially confirms some of what I said.
Mm-hmm.
When women are useful, then they get mobilized and seen as political actors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question? Natalia.
Hi, Sole. Thank you very much for your presentation. One question about the map that you showed in the beginning of the presentation.
Okay.
I found really interesting that one of the states in India had a really high, that is state on the south. Would you mind to just talk a little bit about that one and how different is that state compared to the one that you chose?
Yeah, so the one in the bottom left corner that has the highest values of women's non-electoral participation is Kerala. If any of you have heard of Kerala, Kerala is known as like the miracle for women. I also want to start by noting that really high here means 40%.
Mm-hmm.
So not really high, but just relatively high. So a few things about Kerala. Kerala has the highest level of women's education in the country and invested very early on in women's education. SHGs started in Kerala in like the 1980s, and they became a state program in, I think, the 1990s, a program called Kudumushri, which was the program that the national government decided to follow when they implemented a national program in 2015. And so Kerala is also just known as having very different gender norms. And so for anyone who studies gender, the least representative case, but maybe the one where we can learn how you get to different outcomes, is Kerala. Tamil Nadu is also a state like that. The Northeast, that also has some yellow, is a very different set of communities. There's a lot of separatist movements in the Northeast. These are, and so politics looks very different there. And I think this is Manipur, but I may have gotten that wrong. There is a long history of women as activists in the separatist movement that changes some of those dynamics in the Northeast. So these are a bit of outliers in the country in terms of women's empowerment more generally, and that spans labor force, that spans norms, that spans lots of things. Though again, I still want to caveat that, like, even in places that, that look more empowered, there still persist many gender gaps.
Okay. Someone else? You're shy today. No? That's okay. So I would like to thank you really, really much for your presentation. It's a really awesome everything that we learned a lot. I'm sure that everybody learned a lot today. Thank you very much for it, to show us an in-depth research, mixing methods all the time, just to provide us an answer for a very important problem. Thank you very much for it.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.
So tomorrow we have classes, although it's São Paulo anniversary. I just have a warning mostly for those who are not from USP. For you to get into the campus, you must use your budget. Do not forget it, please. Please. Okay? And we're going to offer you lunch tomorrow, so if you're afraid for that. Okay, thank you very much for being here.